everything comes back to Plato in the end. And if philosophy is the queen or mother of all sciences, then Plato is the king of it all.
This is Common Sense Generation. Common Sense Generation. Good day, the viewers of Common Sense Generation. My name is Maciej Kądzielska-Koper, and this is our show about philosophy. With me is Dr. Maciej Wilmanowicz, philosopher and intellectual historian.
Intellectual historian would be a much more suitable phrase, I'd say.
So a man of many talents. We talk about, let's at the beginning start with philosophy and being a professional philosopher. Why did you decide for this vocation and this profession?
Well, first of all, many thanks for inviting me here. I'm really glad to have this opportunity to talk with you about an interesting topic, I hope. And I hope that we won't make it a boring one. Well, as to your question, I guess that philosophy is a big word, one that I'm rather reluctant to use because, first of all, I am no philosopher by training. I am a lawyer and an historian. But as it happens, during my studies at the University of Warsaw, I quickly realized, as many young people often do, that the, let's call it, traditional path of training to become an attorney or a judge wasn't really for me. All my academic interests led me away from the, what you would call, here and now of practical legal profession and towards more abstract aspects of the law, and especially its, well, institutional and historical development. And I guess I was fortunate enough to stumble upon what in the Anglophone tradition is called the history of ideas or intellectual history, as you said, which is a highly eclectic, interdisciplinary field of study, which requires its practitioners to engage not only in philosophy, but also in history, in sociology, law, political science, theology.
But it all sort of comes out of philosophy. At a certain level, a certain moment in the history of philosophy, it's hard to divide between theology and philosophy.
Sure.
All the medieval philosophy is, in fact, theology, but very interesting one, with developed later in many aspects. So, but it all comes back to Plato, don't you think? Isn't like...
Well, there's this famous saying that I'm sure you've heard, you're sure, and I've also heard it during my legal studies, that everything comes back to Plato in the end.
All philosophy is just...
Yes, and if philosophy is the queen or mother of all sciences, then Plato is the king of it all. So sure, in a sense, yes, you could say that it is indeed highly pertinent, highly relevant to the philosophical.
And just to imagine that he wanted to be a poet.
Yeah.
And it happened. But Plato is fun to read. It's usually something which drives also young people to philosophy. Either they're in love with Plato or they're in love with Nietzsche. You were which one?
Well, that's a tricky question to answer, but I guess my response will be as swift as it is predictable. Definitely Nietzsche. And well, the main reason is the one that you brought up just a second ago. To this day, I remember vividly absolutely fascinating, but come to think of it, rather unusual seminars that were run by Professor Władysław Kulesza at the University of Warsaw, where we took our time and really slowly and methodically read Plato's Republic and Laws, I guess trying to figure out the practical or feasible aspect of it and its underlying philosophical assumptions. But quite frankly, it never really resonated with my youthful, rebellious, I'd say the more skeptical imagination. And part of it, I think, perhaps the most important part, was because the style and the language of the text itself just did not resonate with me, perhaps on account of the translation. Whereas with Nietzsche, on the other hand, well, it's obviously a completely different story. And I think that it is...
it's much more modern text,
yeah,
it's easier to
sure.
read. But on the other hand, when you have a difference between Plato or Aristotle, then definitely Plato is much easier.
Well, I wouldn't want to, engage in this like a game of
in this debate, of course.
Yeah. Yes.
Every path which leads us later to treat philosophy more seriously and to engage is a good one.
Sure.
But it's
although I'd make a few caveats here, because, for example, personally, my reading of Nietzsche, which I think is quite natural for every single young man who is going through like seemingly inescapable period of existential angst in his teens or whatever. Well, it led me to some rather dubious type of lectures. For example, dubious is a bad word, but for instance, the nihilistic writings of Emil Cioran that I spent quite many years trying to process and kind of intellectually overcome. So I think the point of entry, I think, still matters, although I fully agree with you that as long as people are actually engaging with difficult philosophical texts and find them interesting and try to, from time to time, follow the principles that are outlined there, then I think that's, well, it's certainly a positive aspect of it.
And in the recent times, we all experience some sort of crisis of a state, at least for two experiences. One is, of course, COVID pandemic, and the other one is war on Ukraine. And this shows us this very strange idea in modern democracies, but it was already there in the ancient times. So it's the state of emergency, a moment when a state needs to shift, change in order to face the challenge. What is the state of emergency?
Well, now that is a broad question, but I think it's we can try to break it apart into more manageable pieces, and I think it would be useful for us to point out that the notion of state of emergency is actually, or has actually, very strong legal connotations. And it is a common place to say that the modern concept of the state of emergency, as it is used in our modern liberal democracies, has its deep historical roots in the legal system of the Roman Republic. That, not to get into details, but the idea was that there are certain circumstances in which the so-called normal functioning of the state, apparatus, institutions, laws, officials, can no longer deal with, or rather can no longer secure the common good, and thus can no longer fulfill its most important institutional responsibility, its most important duty, the very reason why people decided to form the state in the first place. And as a consequence of this failure, that it becomes necessary for officials to actually act in what we would call an extraordinary manner, of course.
And in Rome, it was this moment of the dictatorship, yes?
Sure. Well, there were two different institutions. One was what was called the Senatus Consulta, which was issued by the Roman Senate, that empowered the consuls to take special actions in order to prevent the threat facing the state. And the other one was, as you mentioned, was the institution of the dictator, which functioned a bit differently to what we have in our current circumstances, mainly because the dictator was appointed for a definite period of time, it was 6 months. And secondly, and more importantly, because the legal system during the dictatorship was suspended in toto, wholly.
Wholly, so
Yes.
It didn't occur.
The legal system simply did not work during the tenure of the dictator, which from our modern liberal democratic perspective is, of course,
a crazy idea.
It's a completely crazy idea. Although our listeners, our viewers might be interested to hear that, in fact, the solution that was devised by modern democratic thinkers and by our states, that is the legalization of the state of exception, has its own problems. And in fact, those problems are so grave, so serious, that some very respected academics, such as Soren Gross, who I believe works at the University of Chicago, are actually presenting arguments seriously to reconsider and think about, at least partially, allowing this non-legal way of dealing with the state of emergency. So in a way, they are trying to come back to the old ways of thinking about the law, its role, and its nature, by splitting, so to speak.
The original idea of making the state of emergency is the fact that to quicker make decisions, yes, to quicker react on the situation. And as a state of emergency could be a war. And in the war, in fact, well, a lot of laws are stopped when we have threat to the state itself, because no law can be kept without having a state. So right now, when we look at the occupied territories in Ukraine, I mean, the Ukrainian law doesn't affect those parts anymore because there is the Russian invasion. So there is some wisdom in it, not a complete lack of, let's say, rationality when you want to very quickly be safe from some sort of outside danger or inside danger, which can destroy and collapse the whole state.
Sure. And the Roman term for it was actually salus populi, which is the safety of the people. So that was, and it was closely related to another concept, which in Latin is just necessitas, which is necessity. So safety of the people is a necessity that can be invoked by the officials to act in an extraordinary way. But what I just said clearly shows how ambivalent a notion we are trying to unravel, unpack.
Even in Rome, they had problems from coming back from the state of emergency.
Of course, sure. But mainly because not only is the concept itself highly ambivalent, but it is also the concept of the state of emergency, but it is also firmly embedded in this highly complex conceptual nexus. Necessity, what does it mean? What does it mean exactly that some circumstances are extraordinary? When is it truly necessary to act in an extraordinary way? Who decides what measures are appropriate to deal with the emergency, and on what grounds? Should he choose wrongly? Should we hold him accountable? Who should hold him accountable? Again, on what grounds? How can we deal with those complex questions? And of course, many answers, were given to all those questions throughout the years. But I think what's the most important aspect of it for our purposes, for our modern purposes, is that thanks to the idea or concept of the state of emergency, we can actually try to think or to pose the most fundamental questions about our common values, their hierarchy, both our individual and shared responsibilities, about the vision of life itself, what constitutes the worth of our life, and also about very different institutional and legal aspects. What is law? What purpose does it serve? Does it have an objective value, perhaps? Or is it just a tool that we can use whenever necessary and in whatever way we deem appropriate at any given time?
And when we go back to the modern times and we look at the state of emergency, when dealing with the COVID pandemic, it was not used very often. The states didn't want to declare the state of emergency. Why?
Well, that's a fascinating question that's been very hotly debated in the academic literature. And essentially, I think there are two types of explanations for this, well, noted, very conscious and deliberate decision not to invoke special powers that are assigned to officials by official acts, such as constitution. And the first type of explanation was actually offered many years ago, right after the 9/11 attacks, when American scholars, legal scholars, constitutionalists, noted a very curious legal development. Many states that do possess special types of legal regulations, whether in normal parliamentary statutes or in constitutions, that are actually specifically designed to deal with the states of emergency, are nevertheless choosing to act through normal legislative channels. That is to say, they are refusing to use the tools that are there for them to use. And the obvious question is why? And the first part of the answer is because of the logic of the political system itself. So to actually use special emergency powers awarded by the Constitution, such as the Article 16th of the French Constitution, which awards to the President of the Republic the so-called pouvoir exceptionnel, the special powers to deal with the emergency, is on the part of the government to actually openly acknowledge that the situation we find ourselves in is critical.
So it's so severe, so it creates panic and
yes,
fear.
that is severe, that our normal institutional and legal channels are no longer capable of dealing with it. And thus, the natural logical next step that many voters or parts of the electorate would take is to think that, oh, okay, so our government is not capable to deal with the situation at hand.
Yeah, let's vote for another one. Let's vote for the
exactly. So the first one is the political process itself, and it also ties in an interesting way to the logic of democracy. Or to be more precise, democratic legitimacy. Because it can be argued that to take such an important decision as to actually impose, say, martial law or state of emergency, without actually consulting the citizenry is somewhat radical, extreme, and also illegitimate. That if those special circumstances are really that severe, and the citizenry agrees, then we should enable the citizenry to actually have its say, and to in a way provide us with the shield of legality and legitimacy. Of course, this is done via normal institutional channels, so by a normal vote in a parliament, right? So so many states actually adopted normal parliamentary bills, normal parliamentary statutes. One of the most famous one was the Patriot Act that was adopted, I believe it was November 2001. So very, very swiftly, right after 9/11. So that would be the first part of the response, the political and democratic aspect of it. And the second one, I think, is I would call the liberal constitutional. And the basic idea here is that at a certain point in the development of European state, many thinkers and many statesmen decided that it is essentially illegal, impossible, undesirable to have this aspect or element of arbitrary, discretionary, contingent, decision-based type of rule within your constitutional system. It was associated with royal prerogative, for example, with supposedly undemocratic, dangerous, arbitrary decisions by state officials. And thus the decision or the natural development, if you can call it that, of many constitutional states, of liberal state, was actually to do something we already touched upon, to legalize the state of exception. And that is to say, to ascribe it into the legal system itself. But the consequences of this are funny in a way, or perhaps paradoxical in a way, because by doing so, we are basically exposing our legal system to a logic that hitherto was not natural to it. Because what was the role of the law before the collapse of this distinction between arbitrary political decision and stable legal rules? Well, the role of the law was to provide the citizenry with legal guarantees, with stability, with safety. Yes, but these were rules that were not supposed to be changed at a whim, right?
Yeah, whenever we create this sort of very rapid changes of rules, and we show to the citizens that the rules actually are not, it doesn't come so naturally, not protecting their rights, but they are just whim of the politicians, then people lose faith in them, they lose respect to them. And I think this is something what we very strongly observed during the COVID pandemic and how the states were dealing with problems. Because suddenly we had stupid regulations which no one was able to follow. I myself broke so many times law during the pandemic that I'm thinking, should I be in jail? But it was just following very often common sense, entering a park, or
yes, obligatory or mandatory masks in public parks.
In public parks, and wearing masks all the time. So this is this crazy element of the law. So when we look at that, that's why the legal system, it's not eager to take the emergency state, as I understand. That's what you're saying.
No, what I'm saying is actually that the fact that many legal systems are actually not using those special legal measures that are there in place is because the way that we treat the law these days is actually very close to the idea of permanent state of exception. Think of it this way.
Permanent state of exception.
Yes, of course. Just to give one example, what is the usual, normal, not contested reaction of the so-called public opinion when something outrageous happens in any given state? Let's say we find
a change of regulations.
A change of regulations. Not only a change of regulations, but a change of regulations that is, the swifter it is, the better. Because if the government officials are not responding to the situation that we face, well, then they are failing at their job, right? They are not doing anything to prevent, well, economic
things
laws.
to happen again.
Yes, of course. And now the interesting question is whether or not perhaps we find ourselves in a situation where the necessity-based thinking that's clearly there when the government officials are faced with external emergency circumstances such as global pandemic, war, terrorism, cyber threats, whatever, whether or not this logic also applies, or whether there's a big difference between their ways of thinking in those circumstances and when they are confronted with internal pressure of the electorate that demands rapid actions, rapid changes in the law, for example, because, I don't know, let's say, because of the soaring energy prices.
And those are very good questions for the punchline of this interview. Dr. Maciej Wilmanowicz was the guest of Common Sense Generation, and his claim is the fact that we all the time live right now in the permanent state of emergency. Would you think about it? Write down in the comments, write to us, and we're very, very happy, and thank you very much for watching our show. And I thank also Polish National Foundation for making this video podcast possible. This is Common Sense Generation. Common Sense Generation.